And as I'm sure you all know, we're here in our Winter Pledge Drive on WPFW, and we're seeking your help, of course, our listeners, to keep the station and this show going. And the theme for this Winter Pledge is WPFW, Revolutionary Radio for Revolutionary Times. So at any time during the show, you can give us a call at 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739. And our fine and excited volunteers are waiting to answer your call and take your pledge of support in helping Darker Than Blue hit our $500 goal. Now, of course, we'd love it if someone out there who really appreciates what we bring to the station could give $500 or more and help us knock this out of the park early. And for our full payment donors, we have special gifts for you. But if you don't want the gift, so I don't know why you wouldn't, you can spread your donation out over the course of a year and be a WPFW sustainer. Whichever way you want to do it, you can get us over our $500 goal by calling us right now. And listeners can support WPFW by going to WPFWFM.org and calling 202-588-9739 or supporting us on Cash App with the handle $WPFW. Looking at you. Grab a paper. A paper. A little piece of scrap paper. No big papers in there? Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. We're having a little some connectivity issues, but I'm hoping you hear me loud and clear, right?
Yeah, you sound good on this end, Ajamu. And Ajamu, with Israel's deepening siege on Gaza and the ongoing genocide against the Palestinians, I mean, this has been what's been dominating headlines and a lot of consciousness also since October 7th, when this latest round of Palestinian resistance kicked off. But I actually wanted to start today talking about another very relevant geopolitical event that I think has been put on the back burner somewhat in terms of people's consciousness with everything that's been happening with Palestine, and that's the war in Ukraine, right? Because people may have seen reports that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently removed General Valery Zaluzhny as Ukrainian commander in chief. And these two have, been at odds really at least in the time since Russia first invaded back in February of 2022. And this contradiction became public last year when Zaluzhny called the war stalemate, which I think is actually an honest assessment of what the war not only was at that moment, but has been for that time. Now, of course, that contradicts the narrative coming out of the Zelensky sort of circles, which has always, and the West has been saying this too, that that Russia is taking this political, just walloping on the field in terms of the military aspect, and although that's never really seemed to be the case, and as it happens, there are rumors that Zaluzhny may be a potential presidential candidate in Ukraine in the future if Zelensky allows elections. And this whole removal of him may very well backfire, as Zaluzhny is known to be pretty popular. But all of this taken also with the internal situation in Ukraine, with people who are even critics of Vladimir Putin have talked about this suspension of democracy, frankly, in Ukraine, with the suppression of dissident parties and things like this, attack on unions. And so I'm just sort of generally wondering, Ajamu, how you're situating the Ukraine war at this juncture within the context of some of these other geopolitical developments.
Well, for the U.S. is very complex. Is a situation where they seem to be taking body blows on multiple fronts. The confusion in Ukraine is the result of a failed policy. A policy that had assumed that a multidimensional conflict in the Donbass would result in significant damage to the Russian Federation and Putin in particular, that it was going to result in a political crisis, that the war was not going to, in fact, last that long, that the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation and the disarticulation of the Russian economy from that of Western Europe and Germany in particular, all would culminate in a much weaker Russia, not only in terms of Russia's ability to influence political events in Europe, but in terms of Russia's growing partnership, if you will, or alliance with the Chinese. It was seen that the one way in which you also get at the Chinese is also to weaken the Russian Federation. All of that did not come into fruition. That basically has been the opposite effect. That the articulation of the development of the Russian economy has strengthened as a consequence of them being forced to develop productive economic activities that were relatively free of Europe. It compelled them to turn in a more pronounced way to the east, And the consequence has been it has provided them more political space from that of the West. So what we are seeing with this with this military conflict, this proxy war, if you will, has been a complete debacle for the Western forces and the U.S. in particular. And the crisis we see now politically and internally to Ukraine is a consequence of that. Many people in Ukraine have recognized that um, they were they were used basically. That a few 100,000 Ukrainian deaths later, it's quite clear that the U.S. And Russia capital, and European capital, are prepared to move on. That they are not prepared to continue to throw money and resources at this conflict, even though the conflict has been very lucrative for the U.S. defense industry. All of the various contradictions, economic and political, are causing a deepening of the crisis in Western Europe and in Ukraine specifically. So this situation is very dangerous for Zelensky because we know from history what happens once the U.S. Uh, believes that you're no longer that valuable to them, then they move on, and those people who they have been working with, either they are able to live a good, comfortable life, or they end up being disappeared from the scene. So it's a very, very dangerous and interesting moment in Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's been what just over has it really been just over a year for that conflict? Almost 2 years, I think, coming up in February. And all of everything that we have been saying since the days leading up to it, has it's obviously come true. And I don't want to sound like, we're the smartest revolutionaries on the streets, but we had it right. I mean, Sean and myself on By Any Means Necessary, certainly the Black Alliance for Peace, everywhere we went, we were explaining to people what this really was, and it wasn't received well. And when I say people, to John Moo, I mean some folks on the left. So I understand that the repression from the state that's what's going to happen. That if you're really into organizing, if you're really a revolutionary, you understand whenever you push back on the state's narrative, their response is going to be brutal and violent and very unfair and very undemocratic. So I don't even, it's not that I don't worry about it, but I know that's going to happen so much that I don't even think about it. It just happens. It's just done, right? But the thing that worries me is we're still connected to these folks on the left who were very much on this. We have to stop Russian imperialism, and Vladimir Putin is the dictator and an imperialist and all this kind of stuff. So how do we go forward with the continued organizing that we need to do? Because even though people aren't paying much attention to what's going on in Ukraine, it doesn't mean that it's over by a long shot. But what do we do with these folks on the left who we've tussled with over the correct anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist narrative in Ukraine that it still seems people haven't gotten it, John?
Well, look, as you indicated, the situation in Ukraine definitely is not over. With the debate in Congress around the aid to Ukraine, that's a very serious one because you have now a coalition of forces that are raising serious questions about the continuation of aid to Ukraine by comparing that commitment to Ukraine and even Israel for some with the conditions in the U.S. And so this situation is going to continue because it has transgressed both parties, and now is seen as a crisis for the entire imperialist class. The other issue that is connected to Ukraine, there's the sharpening contradictions in Europe, is again the short-term objectives of capital. In this case, capital that was allowed to invade and to intrude into the Ukrainian economy as a consequence of laws passed under the Zelensky regime to allow foreigners to come in essence, purchase some of the most valuable land in the country. We all know the role that Ukraine plays in terms of its food production. Significant parts of that food production are now under foreign ownership. And as a consequence of using this excuse of the war, those European and U.S. Agricultural corporations have been flooding the European market with agricultural products, undercutting the farmers in Western Europe who are still required to produce in ways that they say are expensive based on the regulations, and that they are in rebellion to what they see as a conscious attempt to undermine their economic situation and to flood the market and in fact capture the market with cheap goods coming from Ukraine. So now you have a political crisis across Western Europe with elements of both the agricultural workers, owners, and even workers who are now seeing what the real consequence of this conflict in Ukraine is having on everybody economically. So again, the short-term objectives of capital have created for themselves severe crises in Europe and in the US politically. The ruling class is unable to rule in the same way, but they have no clue as to how to get themselves out of situations they have basically created for themselves. So as you said, our task is not so much to even deal with the left that clearly was incorrect in objectively aligning itself with U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism, but to figure out how we continue to build consciousness among the class and national forces we're attempting to organize, so that people understand the terms of struggle today, and so people understand that capital is waging a multi-dimensional, multi-front war because they are increasingly desperate and recognize how this class struggle is sharpening in ways that are not in their favor. So we have to continue in an unapologetic, unambiguous way to project our analysis, to help people to understand what is happening, to sharpen and develop the frameworks of understanding, and continue to push the absolute imperative of people becoming organized and engaging these forces, because we can't take advantage of the crisis until we in fact are in a position to do that. And that means we have to strengthen our organizations. And so part of strengthening our organizations is also is also connected to strengthening the ideological component, the ideological struggle that has to be waged in order for us to strengthen our ability, our capacity to confront the enemy.
Yeah, Ajamu, you've highlighted something that continues to be very underplayed and to go unacknowledged in the West, and that is this neoliberal plunder of Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky has basically been selling the country for parts, and this is completely missing from the narrative of this war that we've been fed here in the U.S. and the West, because up to this point, it has been cast as this heroic struggle for national liberation, frankly, is the way that it's been presented. But all of the sort of typical regime change fingerprints have sort of been conveniently glossed over, except for those of us who have been pointing out some of these things from the beginning. And I wanted to make a connection here, Ajamu, about sort of how all of this impacts conditions here internally in the United States. I'm sure you're aware that recently Nancy Pelosi speaking of Russia, said that Palestinian solidarity activists and movements were being funded and directed by Russia. Now, this points to a couple of things. I mean, number one, not only is the reality of the Ukraine war playing out basically the way some of us said it would, but also we're seeing the specter of Russiagate being weaponized yet again. It's been kind of quiet on that front for a little while, but I think from the time that this myth first gained traction, a lot of us were clear that it would be used to try to tamp down on political dissent here in the US or anything that contradicted the narrative of the status quo. And so I'm wondering what connection you see between sort of the reality of this war in Ukraine and the fact that the U.S. ruling class seemingly doesn't quite know what to do with the vitality of the pro-Palestine movement and what it means for the movement here in the U.S., as you were touching on a moment ago.
Let me hit on both of those points that you made in terms of contained within your question, in terms of the parasitic nature of this neoliberal project and the plundering that it's been involved in over the last almost 4 decades. The situation in Ukraine was always one in which that was the objective. That was recognized by the Ukrainian president that was overthrown, Viktor Yanukovych, or who was presented an option of either developing closer ties with Russia, or in essence, surrendering the autonomy, surrendering the independence, the sovereignty of his nation and economic capacity to the West. But that was really the terms that they were being presented. And he decided, along with some elements of Ukrainian capital, interesting enough, that it was safer to stay in the Eastern Bloc, if you will. And we know the consequences of that. So basically, that led to him being overthrown and the eventual imposition of Zelensky. And under Zelensky, the Ukrainians they engaged in policy that they had never even engaged in, since their so-called independence in 1993. They opened up the economy. They allowed the Western capital to come in and to basically plunder. That to the point that there's no more Ukrainian state. That basically what we have now is a rump state, completely devastated and controlled by Western U.S. capital. These short-term objectives that are also buttressed by the military activity of the West has created longer-term crises for Western capital. The challenge that they have now is as a consequence of the inability of capital to continue to bribe the working class in Europe and in the U.S. That their policies now are resulting in real significant political opposition. The rise of various right-wing groups, parties in Western Europe, the Trumpian phenomenon, can't be understood outside of that context. And that this is the politics that are driving the moment. The situation with Gaza, again, is another example of the inability of the bourgeoisie in Europe and in the U.S. in particular to understand these change conditions, to understand that the ideological grip that they had that allowed for them to engage in imperialist activities without significant opposition internally was no longer viable. That the economic contradictions were causing people to look at things differently and resulting in opposition coming from both the left and the right. And now with the complete stripping away of the veneer of respectability that the genocide in Gaza has presented. The ideological weapon that the West were the upholders of democracy and human rights, it has really created a real crisis, political crisis for these forces. So they're now dependent on more and more naked repression. And that's why critique and resistance is seen as such a existential threat. You know, the fact that Pelosi and others will characterize opposition as being foreign born, foreign supported, exceeds even the kinds of charges people were subjected to during the so-called Cold War in the U.S. It really is an example of the desperation and the crisis of understanding that we see with the ruling class. But for us, it's a very dangerous situation. That's why we find that the national security state is engaged in raids, RICO prosecutions. The Uhuru 3 is facing the possibility of imprisonment. Julius Assad is still sitting in prison. I mean, this is the fascist conditions that are developing in this country. And again, this is not coming from the traditional sort of Trumpian right. That is a bogus, false, distorting, and dangerous proposition. The driving force of fascism in the United States of America is coming from the neoliberal right that controls the state.
Absolutely. And see, this is the kind of clear and afraid analysis that you get here on Darker Than Blue with Sean Blackmon and myself, Jacquie Luqman. Today we're joined by Ajamu Baraka. And, we've got about, 32 minutes left to go or so. We're down to $300. So we have someone to thank, Anonymous in Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, thank you so much for $25. And the other contributors for your gifts. Let me remind you again what a gift of $120 or $75 or $40 or $180 gets you, because a gift of a pledge of $120 gets you the opportunity to choose as a gift for your pledge. Palestine is still the issue. And these are interviews that are conducted or that were conducted by John Pilger. Then for $120, you can also choose Sojourner Truth, Middle East Children's Alliance. And all donations to the Middle East Children Alliance will be a 60-40 split between the station and the Middle East Children Alliance. For $75, you can get 2 tickets to the play Zora at New Cultural Cafe on February 16th at 7 p.m. That's here in Washington, D.C. And for $40, you can get a single ticket to the play Zora at the New Cultural Center. $180 pledge. You can get the Black History Month collection thumb drive, $75 Martin Luther King Jr. Special Collection MP3 discs. For $180, you can get the 6 CD Malcolm X boxed set. For a $200 pledge, you can get Voices Who Changed the World flash drive. Whatever you pledge, however you pledge, call us at 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739. You can go over to WPFWFM.org and make your contribution there. Make sure you choose Darker Than Blue from the drop down. You can call us again at 202-588-9739. Volunteers are waiting for your call, or you can Cash App us at $WPFW. Make sure you put in the note for Darker Than Blue. We've got $300 to go to meet our goal of $500. We can do that, y'all. We got 25 minutes. Let's go, y'all. Let's overcome that goal.
Absolutely. And Ajamu, speaking of Palestine, I wanted to move to this issue of the U.S. and the U.K. very cruelly cutting funding to the UNRWA, one of the main Palestinian aid agencies, over allegations that some of the workers at the agency were involved in the October 7th resistance activities, basically accusing people of being members of Hamas. And according to reports, at least 9 employees have been dismissed as a result of this, with really no evidence at all. And it's pretty clear that this was a move that was done just to, deepen the suffering of the people of Gaza and of Palestine even more than it already has been. And I'm sort of wondering your estimation of where things stand with the Palestine question as of now, Ajamu. I mean, there continue to be protests here in the United States and indeed all around the world. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the U.S. ruling class, I don't think, was really prepared for the level of solidarity that Palestine would receive in this period, and all of the typical, propagandalized atrocity fabrication, things like this. It hasn't really worked. I mean, they've gone after students up in New York. We've seen them literally arrest the organizers of some of those mass protests, confiscating their sounds and things like that. But despite all of this, the movement continues, and so does a Palestinian resistance. So, what is your feeling, Ajamu, about where things sort of stand with Palestine and the movement around
I think that we are witnessing something of historic significance, that as a consequence of the genocide that is still ongoing, the West does not seem to understand there can never be a return back to the status quo, that they have lost all legitimacy, that they are clearly seen as an existential threat to global humanity. Now, that is going to have, and is already having, dire political consequences for them. So, this issue of Palestine has been a epoch changing event. Is part of the transition that's taking place away from continued white world supremacy. The fact that the Palestinians were racialized and then dehumanized so that they became killable and that they are now being slaughtered, with the result of the kind of global outrage, as you said in your comment, John, was unanticipated by the psychopaths making policies in the West. They actually thought that as a consequence of the breakout on October the 7th by the Palestinian resistance, that when the fascist Israeli government decided to engage in a strike against the resistance, and part of that was going to be collective punishment, that they allowed for that activity initially to get massive coverage, because in their own disease imagination, the world was going to, or at least the Western world and parts of the Comprador non-Western world, would support a struggle against the resistance that was characterized as terrorism. And so that was what they thought was going to be the consequence. That was going to, in fact, generate massive sympathy. In fact, I think Netanyahu, who was in deep political crisis within Israel, definitely depended on that. But what happened was the opposite, because I think even at parts of the U.S. foreign policy community were caught off guard at the viciousness and outrageous activity on the part of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza, because what they seem not to be aware of or pretending not to be aware of, is the fact that you had elements in that Netanyahu government coalition. They're straight up Nazis that are fascists. And they saw this as an opportunity to finally realize what they have been advocating for through their political processes for the last few decades, and that is for the complete ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from what they consider to be Greater Israel, from the river to the sea, to expel Palestinians from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip. So they engage in a war of extermination. There was a reason why we saw the images of the Israelis blowing up empty residential blocks. Why is that? Because they were creating the conditions where people could never return. That was the objective. It wasn't about just trying to, eliminate the resistance, because many of us who understand a little bit about military tactics understood that basically what they were doing was providing significant cover for the urban opposition in those built up areas by blowing up these buildings. So, you know, but their objective again was ethnic cleansing. It was, in fact, to carry out a genocide. So this situation that was picked up and exposed globally um, created a situation where the only way that the West will be able to maintain some degree of control is through more and more use of naked violence. And the more they use that, the more they are going to galvanize the counter to that, which is more stiff resistance coming from the global south, coming from the rest of the majority of the world. So it is a crisis of historic proportions, and one that is going to accelerate the transition away from the hegemony of the West and begin to move toward a true multipolar world. Now, it's not going to result in a socialist transformation yet, but it is helping to create the conditions for that, as we see that the alternative that the global South nations, represented, if you will, by BRICS, have already overtaken the G7 in terms of global GDP, and they're now beginning to assert themselves politically. And this is something that cannot be reversed.
Yeah, this is just such a difficult time. And I'm glad that, we here at the station, our theme for this pledge drive is revolutionary content for revolutionary times. And as much as I almost hate getting the updates about what's going on in Gaza, Ajamu, because it is all so horrible. It is all so terrible, especially since now Netanyahu has refused Hamas's counteroffer to exchange all of the hostages. So the however many hostages are left that Hamas has, they will be released if all of the Palestinian prisoners are released from Israeli jails. And this is thousands of people, including women and children, and have been in jail in Israeli, what is called administrative detention, for years, if not decades. And some were just kidnapped by Israel during this siege on Gaza. So, while Netanyahu calls Hamas's counteroffer ridiculous, he said that basically that they're never going to leave Gaza. That's basically Netanyahu's rebuke of Hamas's offer, because the other thing that Hamas demanded was that Israel withdraw from Gaza, that they withdraw from the West Bank completely, and that they leave them alone, and that Israel be responsible for rebuilding infrastructure, and to all that, which sounds completely reasonable to me and you and Sean and everyone listening, I'm sure. But to Netanyahu, of course, it was untenable, and he said that nothing short of complete victory in Gaza it would be satisfactory. I don't see, Ajamu, how Israel with the help of the United States, continues this genocidal campaign unabated at this point. I mean, because the months leading up to this, I guess I can kind of sort of a little bit understand the lack of understanding that people in this country in particular have had about the Palestinian situation. But at this point, there's no denying what's going on. The activity in the streets has not really abated much, and I don't see it abating. I see it growing. So I mean that we don't have a crystal ball, but I sure would love to know what you think, how this ends for Israel. Um, and I just want to give a really quick update on our pledge drive for this hour. Thank you, Anonymous from Washington, D.C., for $100. That person, Anonymous from the Anonymous family, is a new sustainer. And thank you, Wendell Scott from Washington, D.C., whose gift of $120 got him, whose pledge of $120 got him the gift of Palestine is still the issue. We've got $80 to go in our pledge drive, about 15 minutes to go in this hour. So somebody's got $80 they can throw us, I'm sure. Ajamu.
Well, what ends for Israel is failure. When you have amateurs, and Netanyahu really is not an amateur, but he has allowed himself to paint himself into a political corner by defining victory as a complete destruction of Hamas. The consequence of that is, in fact, the kind of genocidal activity that the IDF is now forced to engage in. But what has happened as a consequence of that activity is that there are now serious splits developing between his government and the Biden administration that's now beginning to be surfaced, because the pursuit of this objective in Gaza is causing is causing more headache, more issues for the U.S. administration than they had anticipated. And so you see in the last few days um, the the language sharpening somewhat by Blinken and even Biden when he's able to spit something out regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza, mentioning civilian deaths more. And this is not just to provide further cover, but it is a reflection of the conversations taking place behind the scenes, where basically they are discovering that Netanyahu is out of control. And he's always said that the U.S. administrations can be bullied, and we suspect that's happening. So the counter to that is more and more public distancing that the U.S. government is engaged in with Netanyahu, and behind the scenes, a conversation that is letting them know that we're not going to allow you to basically slaughter another few hundred, another 10 or 20,000 people in this pursuit of Hamas. They cannot result in victory. You can't. The Hamas and the Palestinian resistance are the Palestinians, and the only way that you defeat the resistance is when you commit genocide against the people. Politically, is now becoming more untenable for that to occur. So this is a situation that is developing here or there in Gaza. Now, it's not going to change overnight. They're still continuing. And while the Biden administration will make more noise about the humanitarian situation, Congress is still apparently committed to trying to find a way to send more money to Israel. So we see all of these contradictory kinds of rhetoric and policies being pursued all at once. And again, as a reflection of the confusion and crisis of the ruling class. But I think that the policy is starting to emerge, one in which Netanyahu is going to be prevented from his victory, not by the resistance necessarily, even though they are waging a courageous struggle and are inflicting enormous damage on the IDF, but by the constraints that will eventually be imposed on them, I think, by the U.S. administration.
Yeah, we got about 9 minutes left, Ajamu, and you mentioned Joe Biden and kind of the trouble that he has speaking sometimes, and recently, he takes exception when people raise this, but I think this actually is a reflection of what I see anyway as a deepening political crisis here in the United States. So we're in an election year. Inevitably, I mean, we're already basically getting the message about how important this election is and how apparently it's of this historic life or death stature, where we have Biden, whose cognitive condition I actually think is legitimately in question, on top of the fact that from a policy standpoint, it's hard to point to something that is sort of substantively improved from Donald Trump, at least in terms of improving the conditions of poor working and oppressed people. And then, of course, with the other ruling party, we have Donald Trump, who's just sort of a, unashamed reactionary in a number of ways. And so the fact that these are our two, main presidential candidates, and the fact that this is it's an unpopular election. These are not popular candidates to run this election, generally speaking. It just sort of feels like the tortured democracy in the United States is kind of beset on all sides by its own contradiction and doesn't seem to really have a resolution for them, which I think creates an opportunity for social movements here in the U.S.
I think you're absolutely right. But one way in which we make sure that we can take advantage of it is by not continuing to provide cover for the reality of the so-called democracy. That we've got to be clear in our rhetoric, our analysis, and be honest with the people that there does not exist a democracy in the United States of America. That this, at best, is an oligarchy, a capitalist oligarchy, a dictatorship of capital. We've got to be absolutely clear about that. That the goal in the U.S., or one of the goals in the U.S. for the popular forces, is to, in fact, to establish democratic rule, democratic power of the people. And so we got to be absolutely clear about that. We got to do that too, Sean, because we keep on falling into this trap of allowing ourselves to be drawn into this intra-bourgeois struggle between the two elements of capital represented by the Biden forces, the Larry Fink from BlackRock on one hand, and the Trumpian forces, the nationalists, on the other hand. And so, we get into this lesser of two evil BS, and we objectively give political cover to the neoliberal fascists that are basically strengthening their control of the apparatus, and engaging in all kinds of horrendous crimes globally, while we are fixated on the clownish antics of a Donald Trump, as dangerous as some of those forces are that is grouped around him. And I think that's a mistake. Is a dangerous situation to continue to, because what happens is that even progressive forces, it goes back to Jackie's earlier question, the confused nationalist left, who doesn't understand the realities of fascism in particular colonial fascism that many of us have been subjected to, many of our people have been subjected to, that's now just being imposed within the context of the broader U.S. society, that, we see the duopoly as the enemy. We see the system as the enemy. And, we're clear about that. While some of our friends on the left, they get drawn into this thing where they, in essence, give a pass, a cover to the neoliberal right with this fear of Donald Trump. Look, how do we get past this BS about Donald Trump or any of these elements from the Republican Party being in a position to undermine a democracy that doesn't exist until we go through it? I remember in 1984 that the U.S. Republic was going to end with the re-election of Ronald Reagan. This game has got to stop, and Negroes and fake leftists have got to stop playing this game. Let Donald Trump win. We're going to survive Donald Trump. And for African people to be afraid of some white boy named Donald Trump is an insult to our people and to our history. So we're not concerned about no Donald Trump. What we're concerned about is how do we build the capacity to win? That is the objective you've got to deal with.
Absolutely. And with 3 minutes left, folks, we are still $80 away from our goal, but we are actually probably closer because a couple of folks in the Black Power Media chat have told me that they have donated through Cash App, and we don't see those donations right away. So we are actually closer, if not have met our goal, but that does not mean that we will stop taking your money. No, we really appreciate all of the support that you have given WPFW over the years. And Sean and I in particular are very, very honored and humbled for the support that you have for us. So please, with whatever you have, please donate to WPFW, be a sustainer, become a regular contributor, get one of those gifts for $120 or $180, and keep listening to WPFW, revolutionary content for revolutionary times.
Absolutely. And again, that number is 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739. Again, want to appreciate everyone who has supported the pledge drive this hour, who supports Darker Than Blue. Because, in reality, Jacquie, I mean, it's so appropriate that the theme for the pledge drive is revolutionary radio for revolutionary times. Because when we're in a moment such as this, the propaganda from the ruling class, from the capitalists, from the imperialists, it goes into overdrive, because that is a system that knows it's in crisis, trying desperately to protect itself. And that's one way. It also does it militarily and economically and other ways. So as aggressive as the ruling class is in pushing their lies and pushing the narratives that are against the interests of poor, working, and oppressed people, we have to be just as steadfast, just as intense, and just as committed in supporting news, analysis, and programming that speaks from the social movements, that speaks from the standpoint of people's struggles, and is really trying to be part of a collective effort that's actually going to make the changes in the world that we know are so sorely needed, whether it's the end of Israeli apartheid, the defeat of imperialism, or the overturning of the capitalist system itself. We will need your support in putting our work together. But we want to thank our guest, Ajamu Baraka, so much for joining us today. And that's going to do it for today and this week here on Darker Than Blue on WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C. And we will see you next time. Peace.